I could say that I was inspired by recent events, that this video really nails down how an understanding of history makes things like modern ethical debates plain. But the reality is that the series I need to do on the modern mental illness crisis requires legwork, and I'm procrastinating. So let's procrastinate together with a simple question. Recently, one of the most successful songwriters in Christian music said that he was renouncing his beliefs because, in part, he couldn't reconcile those beliefs with a passage in the Bible where God supposedly ordered the genocide of an entire people group, which doesn't sound like something a loving God would do. And I have no real interest in the religious angle, or if this was genuinely what drove Mr. Samson away from his faith. The question I want to look at is why the Hebrews didn't have a problem with it. After all, they compiled this story, along with a bunch of others, as proof of their God's consistent moral teaching. So our question has three component parts. First, why did a kingdom whose eventual capital city, Jerusalem, which literally means the hilltop of peace, whose basic greeting to one another, shalom, means peace be with you, why did those guys need to kick off their existence by starting a war? Secondly, and most offensive to our modern sensibilities, why did they have to destroy them completely, women, children, and all? And finally, once we've answered why anyone, we can look at why the Amalekites specifically. Just who were these people anyway? And like my video on Pseudo-Frederick, we're about to see another instance where plain old history just goes off the rails all of a sudden and enters the realm of the bizarre. So let's get started with just a touch of backdrop. The setting for the proclamation to destroy these people is that the Hebrews had just gone through a wildly unstable period as a theocracy ruled by a high priest. They finally got some stability under a priest named Samuel, but he was getting on in years and none of his sons looked like anyone the people wanted serving as a go-between with God, and so they demanded a king. They wanted to be a kingdom. And although we have a passage where God refers to this as a rejection of him, still he sends them against the Amalekites. And so we get the incredibly obvious answer to our first question. Why? Because if they didn't, then they wouldn't have been a kingdom, by definition. You see, the history of the ancient world breaks down like this. Way back before written records, early tribal humans branched off into one of two groups, the farmers and the hunter-gatherers. The farmers started to make permanent settlements next to their fields, and these eventually got big enough to be called cities. The hunter-gatherers moved all over the place and came to be called nomads. Now, nomad society didn't change all that much over the centuries. The cities, on the other hand, changed quite a bit. They started doing things like writing down laws and coming up with ever more complicated ways of deciding what those laws were going to be and how they were going to be enforced. We call that a government. Trick was, they were having a really hard time uniting any of these cities together, and they wanted to, they really did. But at this time, each city functioned something like an island surrounded by a sea of nomads, because those nomads would sometimes supplement their shepherding and hunting and gathering by attacking these settlements. And since fighting was right up the alley for people who were hunters, but not so much for people who were farmers, the only way these settlements could hold on was to build defensive walls around their cities. We get a taste of this with, guess who, our friends the Amalekites, in 1 Samuel 30, when they attack the undefended settlement of the future king of Israel. Now, it took David a long time to build up that settlement, and all those years of work were nearly lost in a day because of these marauders. As you can imagine, the cities really did not like the nomads. Every ancient source I've ever seen refers to them in animal-like terms, and it's easy to see why. These were just two ways of life that were destined to clash, and they clashed for thousands of years. And so, the only kingdoms that could form in the ancient world, a kingdom being a group of settlements that are all united under a single leader, the king, had to have some way of dealing with the nomad problem. Egypt had the Nile River, and could use that like a highway for various settlements to support each other against attack. Babylon did it by building a wall that eventually got so massive that the area behind it was more like a county than a city. And if you didn't have something like that, your only option was to have some of those farmers put down their plowshares, pick up some swords, go on offense, and root the most belligerent of these guys out of your area. Israel, at its inception, didn't need a king, because its people were all united by a belief system that separated them from the surrounding people groups. Even so, Their tribes functioned like little islands, and so they developed in different ways from each other. One of those tribes, we're told, the tribe of Benjamin, eventually became so unlike the other tribes, and so hateful to the other tribes, that eventually the others ganged up and nearly wiped it out completely. But if it was going to transition into a kingdom, Israel could only exist if the various settlements had enough security from the threat of nomad attack to do the long-term investing that goes with planting and reaping crops. And that meant that their king had to begin dealing with the existential threat of groups like the Amalekites, or else no kingdom. Which brings us to our second question. Okay, even if we grant that the culture clash and the need to deal with a nomad threat was required to stop acting like a bunch of little islands and start acting like a singular people group, and that this meant attacking the Amalekites, and I promise you it did, why did they have to, as it says, destroy them completely? And he gets awfully specific about this. And to this, we get another really, really simple answer. Because if they didn't, they would have been the Amalekites. You see, in ancient times, the difference between the wealthy and the poor was a very different thing than in modern times. Think about it. A bad tooth meant someone had to yank it out. Didn't matter if you were rich or poor. A hot day meant you either stayed in the shade or splashed in some water. Didn't matter if you were rich or poor. Traveling was a pain. Didn't matter if you were rich or poor. Famine could even get you no matter what, rich or poor. And even what the rich were eating doesn't always seem all that appetizing. But there was one big exception to this rule. Servants. You see, everything back then was labor intensive. Even just going to the marketplace typically meant a long walk and lots of time. Food preparation, mending clothes, keeping anything clean, on and on. It all took a tremendous amount of time and labor. Unless you had servants, and then somebody got to do it for you while you laid around popping grapes in your mouth. Back then, servants were the true dividing line between the haves and the have-nots, and so whenever you attacked someone, you tended to take prisoners, especially women and children, because do that, and voila, your life just got a whole lot easier. And so we see a mirror image of the sacking of Jericho, in which the Hebrews were told not to take anything, but leave it all to burn inside the city. Why? Because this was supposed to be a nation of peace. They weren't supposed to go to war for profit. So the first city they ever fought, they were forbidden to extract any sort of benefit from the battle. Now, later on, once the point was made, once it was established that you're not fighting for money, but we do have to fight, then sure, they could go ahead and collect war prizes. Here we see the same pattern, now as a kingdom. Israel was being told that it was not to deal with threats because it made them money. That's what the Amalekites did. The Amalekites attacked to collect food, barter goods, and slaves. Israel wasn't supposed to be like that. But you say, couldn't they have just taken them alive but not as slaves? And the answer is no, they couldn't have. What would they have been? All their communities at this time were based off of kinship, so family ties. The set of assumptions about the world and humanity's place in it that says that all human beings have intrinsic value. Not just your family, is centuries, and one particular event, hint hint, away from coming into existence. At that point, at the very foundation of Israel as a kingdom, they would have been servants, nothing more. Without any specialized skills, their society had no other options for them. Attack the Amalekites, take them as slaves, and the message would have been sent that being a soldier for this kingdom was not just something that had to be done out of grim necessity, but something you could do to enrich yourself. And then, again, they would have been the Amalekites. With one little exception. And this is where our story goes off the rails. So just who were the Amalekites? They're never mentioned anywhere that we found except in the Bible. That's not surprising. There's not a lot of writing from this period that has survived. And we think of the Bible as a singular work, but it's actually a collection of various written works, spanning a period of about 1,500 years. Just the various statements about the Amalekites cover nearly 1,000 years, from multiple different sources, from different stages in the progression of Israel, and they all say the same thing. Who were the Amalekites? The name Amalekite means those who lap up water like dogs. Remember what we said about thinking of the nomads like animals? Oh, and for any biblical scholars out there, you just found out why Gideon attacked the army of nomads with only the 300 who lapped up water like dogs. It's because once the attack began, the nomads couldn't tell who was attacking them, because these either were nomads expatriated or descendants of nomads, and the invading nomads couldn't tell the difference between the attackers and their own various clans, which is why they started hacking each other to bits. Notice this passage. This phrase, from generation to generation, in other words, as long as they exist, will never be used again with anyone else. Not the Philistines, not the Romans, not anyone. So how did the Amalekites earn this level of enmity? If you're a Christian, the word is so obscure that it's not even in your Bible, unless you have a TLV, which is written by Messianic Jews, or are reading a Hebrew Torah. You see, the word is korka, and if it had been left in the passage, it would say the Amalekites attacked the Hebrews because they happened upon them, or because they chanced upon them. And even the version we're looking at now gets the usage wrong. That word means luck, chance, randomness, and I can certainly see why scholars would take that as meaning they just happened to run into them. But that's not what it was trying to say. How do I know this? Because there is an entire book of the Old Testament dedicated to what it actually means. In the book of Esther, we get our last mention of an Amalekite with a guy named Haman. Haman the Agagite. So a descendant of the Amalekite king Agag, or his tribe, which we saw back in the 1 Samuel passage. And in Persia, we're told that this Haman was the highest of the satraps, so the feudal lords of the kingdom of Persia. In the story, Haman has a run-in with one of the exiled Jews, and bearing a historic grudge, we're told that he wants to wipe out not just this man, but all the Jews. Then he does something strange. We're told that he casts the poor, or the lot, to decide the day of Jewish annihilation. Why? What is he doing? He is using a korka, like a dice, some sort of random element. He doesn't just want them to die, he wants them to die randomly. Like this.
I couldn't say. Call it. Call it, yes. For what? Just call it.
When the Deuteronomy passage says that they attacked the Hebrews by chance, it doesn't mean they just happened to run into them that day and had nothing else on their busy schedules. It means they did something like that coin toss, something like rolling a dice. This is nuts. You see, this is the high water age of paganism, and during this age there's all sorts of people casting all sorts of lots. It's called divination, trying to learn the future or determine the best course of action by consulting the gods. And people did this a million different ways, from stargazing to examining animal entrails. The book of Esther is saying that Haman wasn't trying to learn the future. In fact, he was apparently rejecting the very idea of a known future, what we would call destiny. So the story of Esther isn't a love story of a Persian king and one of his 1,000-member harem, as it's so often portrayed. It's the story of a contest between the belief that the universe is random and a man who tries to prove that, and the belief that the universe is orchestrated, and how Haman's plans are undone by that orchestration, as we find out when we're told that Esther was put where she was, as it says, for such a time as this, and Haman winds up getting skewered. But this is crazy. We're being told that at a time when absolutely everyone believed in a god or gods, some sort of metaphysical governing agent, the Amalekites apparently didn't. They were atheists, and not like modern atheists, which are just another form of humanist, so people who have taken those governing principles of old and foisted them onto a person or group of people. But we're talking about people who rejected right and wrong completely. No order to the universe at all. And now we know why God said they will be at war for all time. We're talking about two completely opposite belief systems. We're talking about a way of thinking with the Amalekites that is so alien to our modern sensibilities that clip that we watched earlier, the author who wrote the story, Cormac McCarthy, is the only author I've ever even read who has tried to tackle a character who thinks like that. And he did it twice. Once with our coin tosser from No Country for Old Men, and a second time with the character of the Judge from his classic Blood Meridian. What would this have looked like? I've tried to imagine a culture where every tradition, every story, every ceremony is meant to reinforce a belief system we would call sociopathic. No right or wrong. It's not easy. Think about the inhumanity of that. You can't reason with them, bargain with them. They're either going to try and kill you or not, based on some sort of randomized object. No matter what happened in and around Israel, there's no way the developing nations would have allowed these people to exist in the long run. No way. Of course, kingdoms came and went, and eventually gave way to the concept of the nation-state. And for a very long time, wars were fought by small groups of specialists who mostly left the civilians alone. But to the Marty Sampsons of the world, before you get all high and mighty about killing women and children, about how we wouldn't do that, yes, we would. In World War II, we killed tens of millions of women and children. And I don't just mean the Holocaust. Even the Allies targeted civilians. They even timed their fire bombings once they figured out that a city on fire would heat up the underground shelters, forcing the people out after about 20 minutes. They started sending a second wave, 20 minutes later, to burn up those civilians. Not because the Allies were bad people, but because sometimes peace requires harsh measures, and that war, and any large-scale war that we ever fight again, isn't going to be a contest between soldiers. It's going to be a contest between workforces and the weapons they can produce. Heck, the Nazis almost got the atom bomb before the U.S., and if they had, and could have put it into production, the world would have been a very different place. A much more random-looking place. A world Haman might have liked. This is David Reichert from The Bunker. Hit like and subscribe and click the notification bell, and we'll try and put out at least one video a week. Also, our pandemic horror series, The Holocaust Engine, is available September 14th. Link for pre-order down below.